Our speaker today, who probably is familiar to a lot of you who attend these talks because she gives so many great ones, is Elaine Mills. She trained as a master gardener in 2012 and really developed her interest in sustainable landscaping and native plants at that time. She has created fact sheets on tried and true native plants, which you will find on our website. And she has spent the time since 2012 growing native plants and photographing them both at her place and in public and private gardens. And she uses a lot of her photographs in these talks. In the past, she served as a coordinator of one of our demonstration gardens, but this year she moved up and is chairing the whole public education concern with our group. When we ran through the talk, Julie and I agreed that this was more information on container gardening in one place than we think you'll ever find anywhere. So we're delighted to have Elaine start with our talk today. Thank you, Elaine.
Thank you very much, Colleen. And thank you also to Julie, who will be putting lots of helpful information into the chat. Welcome to all of you for Container Gardening with Native Plants. This topic I actually introduced very briefly in a presentation called Small Space Gardening for Pollinators way back in May of 2020. But since that time, I've spent a great deal of effort looking into various resources, doing research on the subject. And I've also had several years actually doing planting of native plants in containers myself. So I'm looking forward to sharing that new information with you today. Before I begin, I'd like to thank a number of other master gardeners in our unit who have been extremely helpful to me behind the scenes. The first is Alyssa Ford Morrell. She and I were co-coordinators at the Glencarlin Demonstration Garden for 8 years. And over the last several years, we created, about 5 or 6 different native plant combination pots. I'd also like to thank her for the use of photographs that she took at Mount Cuba Center. That's a center that does plant trials of native plants, and it also advocates for the use of native plants in our gardens in the Mid-Atlantic. I'd also like to extend a big thank you to Leslie Cameron, Benton Murphy, and Angela McNamara, who are co-coordinators of the Small Space Demonstration Garden. Angela actually helped me create 3 of the pots, and they are allowing me to display pots in their garden there. So thank you very much. Today, we'll begin discussing very briefly the benefits of container gardening. And then I'll move on to give you some tips on containers and soil, specifically suited to native plants. We'll move on to give you some general guidance on native plant selection. And at that point, we'll take a little pause. Then we'll move on to discuss how to use the pots, either standalone pots with a single specimen or various plant combinations. And at the end, I'll be offering you some resources. As Colleen mentioned, almost all of the photographs in this presentation were taken by me. If they're uncredited, they are mine. I have credited the photos that I've borrowed from other folks, and I have a detailed photo credit slide at the end, should you want to know exactly the source of all of those. Container gardening is really ideal for gardeners with limited space, and you can use a variety of locations from window boxes to doorways, steps, small decks or patios, balconies, or even rooftops. Container gardening also allows us, with larger gardens, to grow plants with soil requirements that are different from those of the soil in the garden itself. Container gardening allows us to move plants to change their sun exposure or protect them from the weather. And we could also protect vulnerable plants from deer and rabbits. Of course, plants in containers can easily be moved should we move to a new home. And for the purposes of this talk, of course, I want to emphasize that by incorporating specifically native plants, you can create miniature habitats for pollinators and birds. So, some tips on containers and soil. One of the first considerations, of course, with your pots will be material, and there are many different choices. They have their pros and their cons. Terracotta is one of the most popular choices. This material offers good air circulation, but be aware that the soil in these pots, because of the porosity, can dry out somewhat quickly, and the pots themselves can be susceptible to winter damage. Plastic is lightweight. The pots in this material come in various shapes and colors, but there's going to be less aeration of the soil. Ceramic is a popular aesthetic choice, and some of these pots are even glazed for winter protection. They'll provide insulation and they are more stable, but because of their heaviness, that could pose a problem for movement around in the garden and they may break. Fiberglass is strong, light, and weather resistant, but these pots may be more expensive, and be aware that the color may fade. Metal pots can be stylish and durable, but they are going to become very hot in direct sun, and they could rust over time. Wood is an attractive natural material that can insulate the roots of our plants, but these containers are going to require liners, and over time they can become prone to decay. Cement pots can insulate roots, of course, because of their heaviness. They're very stable. They are available in various shapes. Be aware that with leaching of the material, there can be an increase in the alkalinity of the soil. Color is also a consideration, particularly for outdoor pots, because it will have an impact on the temperature of the soil within the pot. Dark colors absorb more sunlight and heat up the soil. This can be very helpful in the early part of the year, in the spring, to give the plants an early start. But as the temperatures heat up, you would perhaps want to move that pot to a better location. Light color pots are going to reflect the most heat to keep the soil cooler. As far as shape, that's going to have an impact on the amount of soil that's held within the pot and thence room for root growth. Wide, shallow pots, like the one pictured at the top, are great for shallow rooted plants like cactus and succulents. Wide and square pots are going to hold more soil than a circular pot with the same dimension across the top. These are going to require less frequent watering, so you'd want to monitor those for overwatering. Tall pots are going to allow for better drainage and aeration, and this becomes particularly helpful for our native plants, many of which are quite deep rooted. There are many different styles to choose from for pots. You may be interested in whimsical choices. Your tastes may veer more to pots that are elegant, or you may wish to have understated pots that just let the plants themselves stand out. A very important consideration, of course, is the size of the pots. The recommendation is for a single plant to choose a pot that's several inches larger in diameter than that of the plant's root ball. So, for example, for a small plant, you might want a 12 to a 24-inch pot, and then these are the increasing sizes for medium and large plants. If you are creating a combination pot, like the one pictured on the slide, you would want to measure the diameter of each root ball and then add perhaps 2 inches to get the total dimension of that pot. So, for example, the three plants that were introduced into this pot each had a root ball of about 4 inches. And then when 2 inches each was added, that gave us the total dimension across the top of 18 inches. Of course, no matter what the size, what the color, whatever the style of the pot, drainage is a must. Pots must have holes in the bottom for the water to flow through. The only exception would be for a cachepot or a decorative outer pot, but the inner pot would need to have that hole at the bottom. Be aware that if a pot is too small for the plant, which it contains, the soil is going to drain and dry very quickly, and the plant is going to become root bound and stunted. On the other hand, if a plant is actually swimming in a pot that's too large, the soil is going to drain and dry more slowly, and that plant could become susceptible to root rot. And speaking of root rot, I'd like to bust a myth that pot shards, gravel, or rocks are helpful when placed at the bottom of a pot. They are definitely not needed. Scientific studies have shown that water is not going to move easily from the soil through those rocks out the bottom of the pot. And this is going to lead to a wet soil pooling at the bottom. This is referred to as a perched water table. Now, in earlier discussion, Colleen mentioned that she uses rocks in the bottom of a pot for a different purpose. She has a very tall plant, and she's concerned that that's going to become top heavy. So I did a little research, and the suggestions for counterbalancing tall plants would be to use a plant with a much wider base, or maybe even made of a heavier material. Those are going to be more stable. Of course, you'd want to be sure to place the pot on a solid surface that's not going to be adding to the tipping factor, and to protect the plant from wind. Another consideration would be doing what's called double potting. In other words, using that decorative outer pot. You'd put the smaller pot with the plant in the larger pot, and you could put rocks between the surfaces of those two to settle the plant down. Anyway, getting back to drainage, you can also improve drainage in your pot by raising a pot up from a surface with pot feet, and some of those are really quite decorative and attractive. A few tips on soil for the containers. For our native plants, organic potting soil is really the best. Garden soil is going to lose its natural characteristics that make it so beneficial for native plants out in our wider gardens. When the soil is removed, it's not going to have the movement of all the soil organisms that you have when the plants are in a larger spread of soil. In addition, unamended garden soil, particularly clay soil, is going to become compacted and very heavy, and it's just not going to drain properly. You can either use a commercial mix or make your own. Just a couple notes about the amendments that would be in that soil. Be aware that peat moss is a non-renewable resource. It takes thousands of years for peat moss to form, and the harvesting process actually destroys the bog ecosystems and unfortunately also releases carbon, which we're trying to keep in these reserves. Some folks are turning to cocoa coir as an alternative because it can help hold about 10 times its weight in moisture. Cocoa coir is actually fiber that's harvested from the outer husks of coconuts. It's considered generally more sustainable, but it does have a few issues. Some of the cocoa coir may be a little heavy on salt deposits, and you'd want to make sure that that was thoroughly washed so it's not leaching out into the plants. There's been some concern raised that there might be a kind of lock and binding of other needed nutrients, such as calcium and magnesium. Also, cocoa coir may be a little more expensive because most of it is produced in Asia and sent to us from there. Pine fines, the fancy term for describing finely shredded pine bark, is another good organic option. And some other potential amendments could be sand. You would want to use horticultural sand rather than the sand that you get at the beach or sand appropriate for a child's sandbox. This is particularly appropriate for cactus, succulents, and citrus plants. Other amendments might be perlite and vermiculite that could help with soil structure. And compost, of course, will be a wonderful additive to provide organic matter and nutrients for your plants. You really want to avoid these polymers that are often added to mixes that you will purchase. Contraindicated because they actually will be pulling moisture away from the tiny root hairs of your plants. You can mulch as appropriate in spring and fall with compost or leaf mulch to add nutrients to your soil. And you'd want to check roots periodically and then repot with fresh soil every couple of years. As far as pot maintenance, be sure to place soil no higher than 1 inch below pot rims. You don't want it to be pouring over the top of the pot as you're watering. You're not going to need any chemical fertilizers for native plants. Just simply use compost to provide nutrients. You will add more compost to create a richer soil for shade-loving plants. Plants that are native to the grasses and the prairie are going to prefer what's referred to as a leaner soil. Of course, because these pots are outside, you'll want to pay attention to the weather to determine the watering routine. As with your garden plants, you can deadhead the flowers and prune them to control the height and maintain a nice definition and balance. As pots become crowded with plants that are growing very large, you can divide them and then share them with your friends and neighbors. A few last pot care tips. Of course, container plants are going to become more vulnerable to winter cold. So you can group and shield those plants on the south side of a building. Alternatively, you could heel them in, kind of tip them on the side, maybe even put a little bit of soil over them, cover them with leaves, or do what is shown on the slide here and actually cover them with blankets that are designed for the purpose. If you're reusing an old pot, you're going to want to scrub it out, wash it with hot soapy water, and then disinfect it to prevent spread of any disease-causing fungi or insects. And from time to time, you'll want to remove mineral deposits. These can form on the edges of a pot, either due to use of hard water, if you were to use any soluble fertilizers, or if there was poor drainage in the pots. These mineral deposits are going to burn and desiccate plant stems that are lying against them. As far as pot placement, it's recommended that you place the pots where the roots can remain cool, but the leaves will continue to receive sun. You may actually need to shift locations with the seasons for proper sun exposure. And for the heavier pots, you'll definitely want to think about portability. At our Glencarlin Library demonstration garden, we actually have made use of an old library cart to move our plants around. And you can also use plant caddies with casters. Some of them are even as wide as 3 feet across for moving very big and heavy pots. Of course, there will be special considerations for balconies. You'll want to confirm building regulations because they may ask you to use lighter weight pots. If you can get permission, it would be ideal to use trellises for vines or brackets for hanging baskets to increase the amount of space for your balcony. Of course, it's critical to determine the amount of sun exposure that your plants will be receiving each day, and certainly be aware of wind gusts that can become more magnified the higher you go. I've looked into the opportunities for pollinators to reach you if you are planting on a balcony. And apparently they can fly as high as 150 feet in search of provisions. But of course, if there are not a lot of other trees, shrubs, other plants surrounding your apartment building, they may not be drawn to that area. Now let's move to some suggestions for your actual plant selection. When you're using native plants in containers, you're going to be relying more on perennials as opposed to the showy summer-long blooming annuals that we normally think of in pots, like petunias, let's say. Because native plants are going to be blooming for maybe 3 or 4 weeks or maybe a month or two at a time, but not the whole year, you'll also want to rely on attractive foliage to give interest throughout the year. You can use more compact cultivars when appropriate, but keep a couple of things in mind. You'll want to retain the flower color and the shape of the straight species. That will allow the plants to be recognized by our pollinators. And ideally, you will also choose plants where the foliage color, the green natural color, is retained. That's going to allow the plants to serve as larval hosts. That means that the caterpillars of our native butterflies and moths could feed on those plants. That allows the full life cycle of those insects. My friend Alyssa urges us to feel free to mix our native plants with friendly non-natives for color, fun, or food. She likes to use plants like Persian shield and coleus that have very showy foliage, salvias that have bright color. Euphorbia diamond frost adds a light white touch to a pot, and she even uses peppers. Of course, when you're using your native plants, as you would with any other plants, you'll want to match the plants carefully to the growing conditions that you have. Looking a little more closely, you can really use any type of native plant, perennials, ferns, grasses, sedges, rushes, even small shrubs and vines. I haven't experimented with trees. You would need quite a large container to do that, but I know that is entirely possible. Now, if you have pots you want to put in a sunny location, you would want to select plants that are native to our prairies and open fields. Examples would be grasses, asters, goldenrods, and sunflowers. For shady locations, choose woodland natives that would grow in dappled shade, such as wildflowers, ferns, sedges, and heucheras. And if you decide that you want to actually create plant combinations, it can be very helpful to use this familiar combination formula. You would choose one plant, let's say a single upright specimen that has very striking characteristics. You would use that as your thriller. Then you could fill in with plants below that with a shorter height to add mass to the container. And then finally, you would use spiller plants that could actually trail over the edge of the container. And of course, you would want to group plants that are all going to have the same sun exposure and soil moisture requirements, since they'll be combined in a single container. So let's get down to the fun of discussing the actual types of plants that you'll be using. The asterisk on this slide is a reminder to me that you may at this point want to refer to the extensive handout that I've provided. This is going to list every one of the plants that I will be discussing. You'll see both the common and scientific names of the plants, and there are hot links from that handout to fact sheets. Many of the fact sheets are the tried and true fact sheets on our Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia website that Colleen referred to earlier. These will show not only the characteristics of the plants, but they'll also provide you some care tips. In some cases where we didn't have fact sheets ourselves on our website, I've referred you to other reputable sources. So let's start looking at the ferns. These will be plants that you will use in pots for shade. Christmas fern and marginal wood fern are evergreen, so these would be great as fillers in combination pots. Tall royal fern could be used at the back of a pot with great moisture. Ostrich fern is so large you would probably want to use that one in a solo pot. Of course, ferns are non-flowering, so they're not going to be providing any support for our pollinators, but the plant parts can be used in nest construction by birds. For additional details on these and many other ferns, you can refer to the recording of a presentation I gave on common native ferns of the Mid-Atlantic, and your handout has a link to that. Grasses are another great choice. With our native grasses, they're going to have long roots, so you'll want to use these particularly in deep pots. I love grasses because they really bring life to a garden. You, of course, have the interest of the movement of these stems with even the slightest breeze. There's the rustling sound of the plants. Light has beautiful effects when you see the flower heads backlit. And then, of course, there will be the lingering seed heads through the season. Warm season grasses, such as switchgrass and little bluestem, are great for use in the sun. Because of their height, they would probably be the thriller element in a combined pot. Purple lovegrass, which is shorter and wider, could be a nice filler plant. Pink muley grass is so spectacular that would probably be best as a solo plant. And cool season grasses, such as bottlebrush grass, are going to be best in shade. The grasses are going to offer seed for birds, and they are also larval host plants for our skippers. You can learn more about these and other native grasses in this recorded presentation. Related to the grasses are the sedges. These are generally best used in shade pots, and their inflorescences are much more subtle than the showy flowers of the grasses. You could use low spreading or clumping species, such as Pennsylvania sedge or Appalachian sedge, for the base layer of a pot. Larger ornamental species, such as plantain leaf sedge or gray sedge, would be excellent as either fillers or solo accent plants. And these are going to provide seed for birds, and they are also larval hosts for skippers and satyrs. You can refer to that same recording on grasses, sedges, and rushes for additional information. There are numerous perennials for you to choose from, and they come in such a wide variety of colors. Eastern blue star, blue wild indigo, and garden phlox show you plants that are on the cooler range of the color spectrum, while bee balm, Turk's cap lily, and oxeye are just a few of the many examples of the very vibrant, warm colored plants. As I mentioned, most of these are going to flower for maybe a month, in some cases a little bit longer. So if you have multiple pots, you would want to plant for successive bloom to have interest in your patio area or on your balcony through the season. Perennials can be used individually or combined with some of the other plants I've been mentioning. And of course, their use will depend on their overall size and their preferences as far as sun and soil moisture. The perennials are going to offer a variety of floral resources, pollen and nectar, and even plant resins. After they've gone to seed, the birds will be able to enjoy that, and many of them also are larval host plants. You can learn about plants that will take you through the summer and the fall in these two recorded presentations. There is one particular set of perennials that entomologist Doug Tallamy refers to as keystone species. These are plants that are going to be especially supportive of our Lepidoptera, that is, the butterflies, moths, skippers, and satyrs. The reason for this is that these plants not only offer nectar to the adult stage of these insects, but then the adult females will lay eggs on these plants. The hatching caterpillars will be able to get nutrition from them. Not only are we therefore supporting the full life cycle of these desirable insects, but the caterpillars are really at the base of a food web, and they're especially important as far as feeding the young of 96% of our local birds. So on his website, Homegrown National Park, Doug Tallamy has outlined certain plants for the ecoregions of the East Coast that are especially suitable for container planting. Keystone plants can also be important for insects that we refer to as pollen specialists. These are bees that use the pollen of just certain select genera of plants, or maybe even just one single species of plants. The Xerxes Society, the website created by Jared Fowler and Sam Droege, and books as well as other online resources by Heather Holm all give us really good information on plants that are great for pollen specialists. So let's take a look at the top keystone plants for container gardening. The most supportive of all the genera is Solidago. These are the goldenrods. They are going to support 115 species of butterflies and moths and 42 pollen specialists. Some great examples would be blue-stemmed goldenrod, gray goldenrod, or rough goldenrod. The second most supportive genus is the asters in the Symphyotrichum genus, and they are going to support 112 butterflies and moths, 33 pollen specialist bees. A great example for a container would be blue wood aster. And third in the ranking is Helianthus. These are the sunflowers. And two examples would be swamp sunflower and woodland sunflower. Moving down to some others, the Rudbeckias are again going to be supportive, not quite as many high numbers. Black-eyed Susan and cutleaf coneflower are examples in that genus. Maryland golden aster, lanceleaf coreopsis, and autumn sneezeweed would be some other great examples for your containers. You may also want to experiment with bog plants. These you would want to site in full sun, and unlike the other containers we've been discussing, you would actually use a container with a liner. Some native bog plants can actually grow in standing water. Examples would be soft rush, pickerel weed, and blue flag iris, while others simply require consistently moist soil. Examples would be cardinal flower, marsh marigold, and pitcher plant. A few additional notes on pitcher plant, and I believe I created a link in my handout to an article on growing pitcher plants. These require full sun in order both to develop their color and to remain completely erect. They're going to need a special soil mix. And very interestingly, they can only be watered with either rainwater or distilled water. And one other type of plant you might want to add are the water lilies that are in either the Nymphaea or the Nuphar genus. Moving on to woody plants, containers can actually be a great way of controlling this vigorously growing category of plants because many of them spread by root suckers. So even in a garden where you have plenty of room, you may want to use a container for control. You would do this by placing the container at the base of an arbor, a trellis, or another structure, and allowing the plant to twine around as shown here on the slide. Native vines come in many different colors, and some, such as Virgin's Bower, Coral Honeysuckle, and Carolina Jessamine, are actually semi-evergreen. Vines are going to provide floral resources, that is, pollen and nectar, and they'll either offer seeds or nutritious fruit for our wildlife. Some even serve as larval host plants. And with their dense foliage, they can also offer nesting sites for birds. You can refer to this recording for additional information on these and other native vines. Another category of woody plant to consider if you have the space would be using small shrubs. Some, such as wild hydrangea, common yucca, New Jersey tea, and dwarf fothergilla, are actually rather small naturally, maybe 3 to 4, 5 feet at the most. As you can see, the flower color for native shrubs is often white, but some are going to have bright fall foliage. The example here is dwarf fothergilla, and others will have seeds for winter interest. These, of course, are going to provide floral resources as well as seeds and nutritious fruit for our birds. And some also serve as larval host plants. I've given several presentations on native shrubs, so you could refer to either one or both of these to learn many more details about the plants shown on this slide, as well as many other selections. Now, if you're interested in using a native shrub that normally would be taller than the ones on the previous slide, you might be able to use smaller size cultivars. These are going to have the same flowers and fruit as the species, but you would want to retain the natural green foliage in order for these plants to be used as larval host plants. Inkberry and yaupon are two examples of evergreen native shrubs, and gembox and nana are just two examples of various smaller cultivars. Both of these are native hollies, and winterberry, a third type of holly. All three of these are dioecious plants. That means that there will be separate male and female shrubs, and you would want to get a match should you wish to have the fruiting on a female plant. So for the example of winterberry, the female berry poppins would be pollinated by the petite Mr. Poppins. There are multiple cultivars of red twig dogwood. Arctic fire is just one of them. Black chokeberry has many cultivars. Lowscape mound is the shortest of them, topping out at about 18 inches to 24 inches. And there are numerous cultivars of Virginia sweetspire, Little Henry just being one of them. We'll look real quickly at some standalone pots. These can be used, first of all, for controlling spreaders like the vines. Another plant to control might be something like river oats, a very aggressive grass. You could also contain members of the mint family, such as the mountain mints, bee balm, or obedient plant. Other examples might be the coneflowers or blue mist flower. Containers can also be used for special situations, such as corralling a prickly plant. A good example would be our native eastern prickly pear, and a taller species would be rattlesnake master. Containers, as I mentioned at the outset, can also help you to control the soil pH for acid-loving plants. Blueberry, for example, pictured here, requires a soil pH of about 4.5 to 5.5, in contrast to the normal neutral range of around 6 to 7. Other examples of acid-loving plants in the Ericaceae family are mountain laurel and pinkster bloom azalea. I haven't had a lot of experience myself with this kind of adjusting of soil pH, but if there are any questions, I can talk briefly about this when we discuss in questions. One other important sidebar comment to make about highbush blueberry is that it is truly a keystone species. It is going to support 217 species of butterflies and moths, as well as 14 species of pollen specialist bees. You might also want to use a solo pot for specimen plants. Jacob's ladder, of course, is lovely when it's in bloom, but its ladder-like foliage is attractive all year round. Eastern blue star would be a stunning solo plant in the spring with its blue flowers, but it's equally attractive in the fall with bright golden foliage. Culver's root is absolutely spectacular with these candelabra-like flower structures. Common moonseed is very attractive with its leaves. And this is a great example of how you can actually use a little trellis within the pot itself. I've mentioned pitcher plants, and they are fun to look at no matter what stage of growth they're in. Another fun plant might be the running tapestry cultivar of foam flower with its lovely trailing stems. A few other examples: American beautyberry with its stunning fruit, ostrich fern. This is a look at the very large sterile fronds, but this particular plant is also interesting through the season with fertile fronds that get sent up and are retained through till spring of the next year. And I've also mentioned lovely pink muhly grass. Its inflorescences catch the sun and look almost like children's sparklers. We could take a break at this point, Colleen, if there are any questions.
Thank you. I know you have a reference to this, but would you mind talking a little bit about how to clean pots, specifically the mineral deposits, if you're going to use it again?
Right. There's actually a whole article that I provide a link to. It's on the very bottom of the resources list, how to
Yes.
clean and disinfect plant containers. And that's from Iowa State University Extension. They're going to be using a combination of scrub brushes and then that soap. And sometimes they'll actually be using things like bleach or alcohol to really get that extra deposit removed, but refer to that article for more in-depth details.
Okay, thank you. There was a question about, is using a bag to grow mints a good idea if you want to try and contain it and not let it invade your garden? Or would you use other containers instead?
I have to admit, I did not use bags or felt containers as an example of a potential container that could be used for these plants. I don't have any experience with those, but I just recently handled the captioning for a very interesting talk on container planting for vegetable plants given by Ben Murphy. And
Uh-huh.
he was asked questions about the felt pots. One thing that he said about them is that with that fabric material, they're going to be drying out more quickly. So you may need to keep plants that are in those pots watered more regularly. In addition, they can give way over time. The potting material can actually disintegrate. Some of them, which use PVC pipes to give a little bit more structure to them, can actually give way at different points. They can be quite heavy and difficult to move around. So given some of the information that he provided in that talk, I was not offering that as a suggestion. But if you've already put your plants in that type of a pot, just go with it and see how it goes.
Yeah. And you would, of course, recommend a container for growing mint.
Yes, I was suggesting that for the mints. Now, I actually grow Pycnanthemum muticum. That's one of the many mountain mints. I personally don't grow it in a container. It does spread, but I find it's fairly shallowly rooted. So I just simply dig it up from where it's spread. I'll either move it around to other parts of a bed where I would like it to be, or I'll offer it at a plant sale or to friends who might like to have that plant.
Someone asked if muley grass can overwinter in zone 7A.
Yes, it should be able to overwinter. I've grown it myself. The one thing you want to be careful about with the overwintering, pick muley grass is a warm season grass. That means it tends to like slightly drier, more lean soil. So it can be particularly prone to rotting if it gets too much moisture in the winter. So particularly if it's in a container where it would be getting a lot of rain, you would just want to be really careful about that with the overwintering.
Okay. Someone else asked about hanging baskets and realizes they dry out relatively quickly. Are there plants that you would recommend for that particular setting?
You know what? I actually didn't investigate that. I haven't had experience with that myself.
Mhm.
So as we're going along and I'm featuring plants that I think of as being particularly suited to drier conditions, I will try to flag those. It's absolutely true that you're going to want to be very alert, particularly if we're going through an extended period of drought. You might even be watering several times a day.
There was a question about coconut coir grown as a monoculture, but Julie put an article in the chat that I think probably will answer that unless you want to comment on it.
I might want to look a little further into that. And as with any other questions that I'm not able to answer completely right now in our live session, I'll be creating an addendum document, and that would be sent out to anyone who attends and also posted on the website for those who come to see the recording at a later date.
Okay, that's it, and we're already getting compliments, Elaine.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much, everyone. Let's move on to the really fun aspect of discussing plant combinations. First, we're going to look at some single season plant combinations. Now, I mentioned that I had done a lot of research, and so I referred to either websites or very in-depth articles by different organizations that are advocating the use of native plants in containers. And one such example is the website of Plant Nova Natives that's based here in Northern Virginia. Now, unfortunately, as informative as these websites or articles are, they list a lot of details on the plants to put in the containers, but they have relatively few, if no, photographs of the actual plant combinations. So for the purposes of our discussion, I've created graphics. So this big circle symbolizes the pot, and the three circles represent a thriller, a filler, and a spiller. And then what I'm doing is providing photos that I have taken or that I've found elsewhere. Thumbnail photos I have arranged also on the slide, going from left to right. These would be the thriller, the filler, and the spiller. So they'll give you an idea of what the individual plants are like, even though you can't see them all assembled in one pot. So Plant Nova Natives has suggestions for 6 different pots for sun and shade through spring, summer, and fall. And this is the first one. They're suggesting foxglove beard tongue as the thriller, blue-eyed grass as the filler, and moss phlox as the spiller. Beard tongue is going to send up these tall flower spikes with lovely white tubular flowers. They'll be blooming in May, and these are very attractive to pollinators. They have a really nice basal rosette as well. And you'll later on see these attractive seed heads. Blue-eyed grass, despite the name, is actually not a grass. It's a member of the iris family. It has delicate pastel blue flowers that are set against rather sword-like or grass-like leaves. This is going to bloom a little earlier from April to May, and it's a bit shorter at 1.5 to 2 feet tall. And the shortest of all the plants, only about 3 to 6 inches high, is moss phlox. This will bloom earliest, maybe as early as March to April. It has a mat-like habit, so it will actually droop over the edge of the pot. There are many different colors, lovely pastel colors, and the blooms will be set against needle-like foliage. And that foliage, as well as the foliage of the 2 other plants, is all semi-evergreen to evergreen. This slide, I'm just showing if you wanted to have a much larger pot, you could actually introduce multiple plants of those same species. A second example from Plant Nova Natives for spring features wild bleeding heart as the thriller, woodland phlox as the spiller, and this time blue-eyed grass is used as the spiller. Wild bleeding heart has beautiful heart-shaped blossoms that are set against a fern-like foliage. They will be blooming from April to May. Blooming at the same time, but a little shorter, is lovely fragrant woodland phlox. And we've already discussed the lovely blue-eyed grass that here is being used as the spiller. It will have not exactly drooping stems, but arching leaves. When the plant is placed at the edge of the pot, it will somewhat go over the side. The phlox and the blue-eyed grass both have semi-evergreen foliage. Plant Nova Native's sun example for summer has switchgrass as the thriller, orange coneflower as the filler, and yarrow as the spiller. Switchgrass, of course, is going to be quite tall as 3 to 6 feet. It is a warm season grass, so it gets a somewhat late start, but it will begin to be sending up these lovely inflorescences around July to August, and these will actually last through the winter time. Orange coneflower has lovely composite blooms, several inches across, great for our pollinators, shorter at a maximum of about 3.5 feet tall. It will be blooming from summer on into the fall. And the yarrow will likewise bloom from summer to fall. It's about 2 to 3 feet tall and has somewhat of an arching habit. The grass will turn tan in the winter. Of course, you would retain it for the seed heads, as well as keeping the seeds of the coneflower for birds. Shade plants for summer might be great blue lobelia as a thriller, blue mistflower as a filler, and Pennsylvania sedge as the spiller. Great blue lobelia is quite tall, about 2 to 5 feet tall, with lovely tight blossoms that will be opened up and visited by especially bumblebees. This will be blooming from July to August. Blue mistflower is quite a vigorous plant, a good choice for filler. It is somewhat shorter at about 1.5 to 3 feet tall. It will be blooming around the same time. And then Pennsylvania sedge was much shorter. It spreads via rhizomes, so over time it could create quite a nice spiller level. That actually blooms in April with these subtle inflorescences. And the lobelia has basal leaves that will remain through the winter, and the sedge will also be evergreen. Now looking at Plant Nova Native suggestions for fall. The first features aromatic aster as the thriller, fireworks goldenrod as the filler, and pink muhlygrass as the spiller. On this slide, I'd like to introduce the concept that you can use the combinations that I'm showing simply as a template, and you might actually want to come up with your own plant substitutions. And that is what I'm going to recommend here. I love the 3 plants that they've chosen here, but I find that they all grow about the same height, maybe 3 feet or so, and they all have a somewhat similar open habit. And I think particularly of pink muhlygrass is so stunning, you would want to have that in a solo pot. So my suggested replacements would be for the aromatic aster, I would substitute another aster, New England aster. This is taller, so that's going to give better definition to the combined arrangement of plants. It's about 4 to 6 feet tall, blooms August to October. Rather than the taller fireworks goldenrod, I would suggest golden fleece goldenrod. It's much shorter, 2 to 3 feet tall, and it has really nice basal foliage, very attractive. And as a spiller, I would use instead purple lovegrass. It's somewhat shorter than the pink muhlygrass, but it still has these pretty inflorescences. And it's going to be blooming from July into October. And as I mentioned, the goldenrod has evergreen basal foliage. The other example from Plant Nova Natives, this one for shade in the fall, is maidenhair fern, blue mistflower again as a filler, and alum root as the spiller. Maidenhair fern grows about 2.5 feet tall. It's not flowering, but quite showy. It has wiry black stems, and the fronds, rather than coming out from the base, are held at the top of the stalk in a fan-like arrangement. Absolutely beautiful. We've already discussed blue mistflower. This is a fairly aggressive grower, so you may find that you would need to be removing some of it over time. Now, the alum root does send up fairly tall flower spikes, up to 24 inches tall, but those will just be showy for the early part of the season. They'd be blooming in May. So the basal foliage at about 9 inches is going to be perfect as a spiller plant. The alum root does have evergreen basal foliage. Now let's move on to some multi-season plant combinations. And to begin with, I'll be showing you some of the examples that Alyssa Ford Morell and I created for the Glen Carlin demonstration garden. And because I grew these, I've been able to take photographs, and you get a much better idea of how these combinations will grow. The first example that we did for sun had a blazing star as a thriller, butterfly weed as a filler, and wild strawberry as a spiller. And you can see how attractive it is as a spiller with those trailing stems. Blazing star will be the tallest of the plants, with beautiful blooms attracting both butterflies and bees in August. Butterfly weed is one of the appropriate milkweed species plants, great for supporting the full life cycle of our monarch butterflies. And the wild strawberry, of course, is much shorter, 3 to 6 inches tall. It blooms in April, and then you could actually harvest fruit from the plant in May. The plant combination was actually created in 2023, and this just shows you how the growth will continue through the seasons. So in mid-April, you would see wild strawberry coming along and actually blooming with just a bare start to the other plants. By May, the other two are coming along. In mid-June, you see butterfly weed. Then by early July, blazing star is flowering. And then in August, you'll see the seed pods of the butterfly weed. And this group of photos I just took literally a few days ago, just a downward look and a view from the side, showing you how attractive this pot is now 2 years later. Another combination that we created for sun featured tall purple coneflower, the Shenandoah cultivar of switchgrass as the filler, and this particular cultivar of lanceleaf loosestrife for the spiller. Many folks are familiar with echinacea, the purple coneflower. It grows about 2 to 4 feet tall, very attractive mauve blossoms. I would personally urge you to go with the straight species. This plant, more than any other perennial, has been modified countless times, but this form with this color and the prominent cone are going to provide the best support both for the pollinators and then with the seed head for the birds. And that's what those seed heads would look like in the fall or winter. This particular switchgrass, the Shenandoah cultivar, has a very colorful fall foliage that's about 3 feet tall. And this shows you the yellow flowers of the lanceleaf loosestrife. Then just looking at this group of plants through the season, mid-April, an early start, then they're coming along. The switchgrass, as I mentioned, is a warm season grass, so it starts a little bit slow. And then you'll see the coneflower blooming in late June. By early July, you're going to see a good growth on the switchgrass, and the loosestrife will be very prominent. This is a sun combination that happened rather spontaneously. We actually had a pot of mountain mint. We were trying to control its growth, and we had a Virginia creeper volunteer in that same pot. So it became both a filler and, as you can see, a lovely trailing spiller. Clustered mountain mint, Pycnanthemum buticum, is an absolutely top-notch pollinator plant. In the Penn State pollinator trials, it received well over 4,000 visits from a wide variety of pollinators compared to hundreds of visits for any of the other plants in the trial. It also has these lovely seed heads that will be seen fall to winter. Virginia creeper has a very attractive palmate leaves, and that these can turn a brilliant color in the fall. This is one of the first of the plants that we created for part shade to shade, featuring alum root for the thriller with its tall flower spikes, marginal wood fern, here you can see what it looks like from above, and creeping phlox. The alum root is going to be blooming in June. The fern, of course, is non-flowering, but evergreen. And here's a look at the lovely flowers of the creeping phlox. Then just a little look at the change in this group of plants over time. The alum root foliage became more marked with variation. The flowers became much more abundant than in that first year. The fern put on tremendous growth by mid-May of the second year. Unfortunately, the phlox died out due to the loss of an overhanging shade tree. So this is just an example that you may need to be aware of environmental impacts. But now this particular plant combination has been moved to the shade, so the fern and the alum root have abundant foliage, and we have replaced the creeping phlox. Another pot for part shade to full shade features thimbleweed, Christmas fern, and running tapestry foam flower. Thimbleweed has quite tall flower spikes. It would be blooming in April. And this is a look at the interesting thimble-like seeds in July. Here again is our evergreen fern. And here you see the beautiful blossoms of foam flower, very accurately named. It's only about 6 to 12 inches tall. And this particular one is known for its trailing foliage. That makes it the perfect spiller. So here's another look at change over time. The foliage of the thimbleweed became much more dense. The foam flower foliage, which originally was just a plain green, had interesting variation, more marked. The foam flower actually spread on the top surface by stolons in the first year, and then by the second year, it was spilling over the edge of the pot. Here's just a note on how you may need to do a little maintenance. You may need to tidy up foliage that gets dry in the first year. Be aware with a fern that it will be sending up new fiddleheads, and you would want to be trimming away the old foliage. And then it will be sending up new lush foliage. And this is a note that we actually had to use a little support for the flower stalks of the thimbleweed. And here's a look 2 years later. We've actually moved this pot closer to full shade now. So here's a look at the dramatic seed heads, the beautiful foliage, and the trailing stems of the foam flower. Now moving on to plant combinations that I've just created this year. So these have not had their full time to grow and flower, but I'll just give you some hints about what I'm intending. This particular combination for sun at the small space garden has orange coneflower as the thriller, butterfly weed as the filler, and snow flurry heath aster as the spiller. The coneflower is going to be about 3.5 feet tall, so the tallest of the plants, blooming from July well into October. Here's another look again at the inclusion of this milkweed plant. And then the lovely snow flurry heath aster. The straight species heath aster is a very tall, open, and airy plant, but the snow flurry heath aster is recumbent. The stems that reach over the edge of the pot are actually somewhat woody, and they're densely covered by small flowers, these little delicate white flowers in the fall. Absolutely lovely. A pot that I'm creating for part shade features wild geranium, alum root, and our friend blue-eyed grass again. Wild geranium blooms April to May, and I didn't flag it with any numbers here, but this is also a fairly highly ranked keystone plant supporting our Lepidoptera. Here's the alum root again and blue-eyed grass. And then for full shade, I was quite pleased with how lovely this pot looked from the get-go. Marginal wood fern is the fern I've selected. Foam flower here you see as the filler, and wild stonecrop is being used as the spiller. Of course, the wood fern is going to be evergreen. And then both the foam flower and the stonecrop were blooming April to May. Foam flower, 6 to 12 inches tall, and then the sedum is quite short, 3 to 6 inches tall. It has really very attractive succulent foliage. The leaves are arranged in little whorls, and you can see it's already reaching over the edge of the pot. So this is what it looked like in May. And then here, just a few days ago, even though the flowering has finished, you can see the continuing interest of the foliage because it's so distinct between the three plants. We'll look quickly at some plants that both Alyssa and I photographed at Mount Cuba Center. Here, switchgrass is used. It's either Shenandoah or perhaps Cheyenne Sky. This is Avondale blue wood aster and citronelle coral bells. We've talked about this switchgrass already. That's a great choice for a thriller. Here's the lovely blue wood aster. The interest of this is that the flowers at the center will actually change from yellow to a deeper reddish purple as the flowers are pollinated. The coral bells isn't really used for flowering. The foliage is the focus with this particular plant. The grass is going to turn burgundy and retain its seed heads through the fall. A set of combination pots that I actually photographed just a few months ago. This one features a shrub, dwarf fothergilla, as the thriller, phlox as the filler, and then some kind of a sedge, perhaps Cherokee sedge, as the spiller. So the shrub would be the tallest at 3 to 5 feet, and then these are the attractive fillers and spillers. In the second pot, there is the dwarf form of big leaf magnolia as a thriller. Then phlox and Pallas purple coral bells are combined as the filler, and the wild stonecrop that I just described as used as the spiller. And you can see they're actually going to be having a tree here, a small tree. And then again, the focus is on the foliage with the coral bells. And that's a look again at the lovely star-like flowers of the wild stonecrop. Also at Mount Cuba, they introduced similar pots that focused on the foam flower. Now I'm referring to a lengthy article by the Northern Virginia Bird Alliance, and they're going for some very dramatic plant combinations with much taller shrubs, some that are even almost tree height. So one combination is smooth sumac, anise hyssop, and purple lovegrass. The smooth sumac can actually reach 9 to 15 feet tall, and it is going to have interesting fruit and fall color. Anise hyssop is not actually literally native right here in Virginia. It's native a bit further north, more into the Midwest, but it does grow quite well here in Virginia, a fabulous plant as far as the pollinators. It's about 2 to 5 feet tall with lovely lavender flower spikes. And here's the purple lovegrass that I've pointed out before as a great spiller plant. Another combination uses serviceberry, a small multi-stem tree, as the thriller, Christmas fern that we've discussed as a great evergreen filler, and blue-stemmed goldenrod as the spiller. The serviceberry could grow potentially to 15 feet tall, a great choice with early blooms, especially great for those early emerging pollinators. The tree has fruit and fall color as well. Here's our evergreen fern. And although blue-stemmed goldenrod is about the same height as the fern, it actually grows with very arching stems, which makes it appropriate as a spiller. Another shrub perennial combination, this time with flowering raspberry, Bottlebrush grass and blue wood aster, great combinations for the shade. The flowering raspberry is a thornless caning plant, about 3 to 6 feet tall. It has these lovely raspberry colored flowers. There will be fruit. It is edible, but it's somewhat drier, not as palatable as the cultivated raspberries that we grow. Bottlebrush grass is a grass that grows quite well in shade. It has beautiful strap-like leaves, somewhat like bamboo, and very interesting prickly inflorescences. And here's that lovely keystone plant, the blue wood aster, being used as the spiller. The grass will turn tan in the fall and retain its seed heads for the birds. Then another combination, this uses very tall rattlesnake master as the thriller, purple coneflower, and threadleaf coreopsis. Rattlesnake master is the plant that I mentioned corralling in a container because of its prickly nature. It has somewhat spiny leaves, and even the flowers are surrounded by bracts. Those flowers are very interesting. They're tight clusters that are greenish white. Very interesting, very attractive to pollinators, especially our native wasps. Here's purple coneflower appearing again, this time as a filler, and threadleaf coreopsis with its lovely delicate foliage and long blooming flowers will be the spiller. Another very dramatic combination features Turk's cap lily, New York aster, and clustered mountain mint. Turk's cap lily is quite tall, 4 to 7 feet tall. The flowers with their reflexed petals are very large, maybe about 4 or 5 inches across, very attractive, especially to butterflies. They will bloom only one day at a time, but a single plant can have as many as 40 blossoms. New York aster is going to be somewhat shorter, 3 to 4 feet tall. Again, a lovely plant to take you into the fall, providing great support for late pollinators. And we've already talked about how wonderful clustered mountain mint is as a highly rated pollinator plant. Here's a suggestion from them for a wetland planter for sun. It includes swamp rose mallow, Virginia blue flag, and soft rush. Swamp rose mallow is another very tall plant, 3 to 7 feet tall. It has very distinct, erect, spiky stalks. The flowers are quite large, again, about 4 inches across. These particular flowers are white with what's referred to as a crimson eye. Again, they'll only bloom for about a day, but they will bloom in very quick succession. Virginia blue flag is about 1 to 3 feet tall, and soft rush will have arching stems, making it the perfect spiller. And finally, a suggestion for a very large combination planter for shade from Missouri Botanical Garden. This features a plant we've discussed several times already, blue mist flower in the center, and this would be surrounded by cinnamon fern, Gray's sedge, alum root, common dittany, foam flower, and Pennsylvania sedge. And a few final comments. Once you've actually constructed your pots, whether they be solo pots or combination pots, you might want to think about how you would group them. One example would be to try to group them in such a way that you have contrasting textures. And this is what's being done at the small space demonstration garden. You might have a group of pots where the pots are identical in design, but they're greatly varying in size. You could also arrange your pots at different heights. And it can be very dramatic to have identical pots arranged in such a way that you can see them all in a nice line at different heights, such as on the steps. One final idea might be a thematic grouping for hummingbirds. They're present in the mid-Atlantic from April all the way into the fall, October to late September. This particular photograph, which I took at Norfolk Botanical Garden, did not feature native plants, but it just gives you a visual picture of how you might use native plants in a similar way. You could grow trumpet honeysuckle on a trellis and then make sure to have containers of plants that would take you through the entire season, providing nectar for the hummingbirds for the entire period that they're here. Wild columbine, Indian pink taking you into the summer, scarlet bee balm, Turk's cap lily in July and August, and then cardinal flower taking you into the fall. And I've also included a link to this wonderful resource by another Master Gardener colleague, Mary Free, Creating Inviting Habitats. She talks specifically about what you can do to attract hummingbirds, but other birds and the pollinators as well. And one final note, I just learned from another Master Gardener friend, Kathy Clements, about a type of container referred to as kusamono. This is a Japanese botanical art form which creates miniature scenes from nature. These are either displayed alone or as an accent to bonsai, and they will capture the essence of a particular season or habitat. They are arrangements most often of mosses, ferns, grasses, and sedges, but they will occasionally introduce flowers as well. And as you can see, they often feature very interesting containers. I provided a link to a site for those, should that be of interest. And as I mentioned, these are some of the resources that will go into great depth. They will review some of the topics I've covered having to do with pot selection, how to use the soil, how to vary it depending on the type of plant you're growing, and as I mentioned, the different plant combinations that I've illustrated for you today. Plant Nova Natives is a great website for us here in the Washington metropolitan area. It lists native plant sellers as well as different seasonal plant sales. Plant Virginia Natives website, as well as the Virginia Native Plant Society website, list native plant sellers elsewhere in our state, but you can also go to the Plant Society websites for various other states to get similar information. These are the photo credits, should you wish to look at those more in detail if you go back to the recording. And now I'm ready to address any final questions.
Elaine, do you have any suggestion for a container plant that would bloom all the way from spring to fall?
I can't think of any single plant that's going to be in bloom that long. There can be plants that will bloom for a pretty long stretch in the spring, some that could take you from late spring into summer, and then some that I've mentioned here that will take you from summer into fall. But no single plant is going to be interesting all by itself, just for its
Okay.
flowers. That's
Oh,
why I suggest that you either find a plant where you're going to enjoy seeing the foliage after it's finished blooming, or you try to create these multi-season combinations so that you will have plants that are blooming at different times. But then again, you're choosing them for the foliage as well. For example, that combination pot for the shade that I created for the small space garden. I think having a fern, the foam flower foliage that's rather heart-shaped, and then the interesting succulent foliage of the sedum is just absolutely stunning, even green. I'll try to think of some of the plants that would be the longer blooming ones and suggest those.
someone else asked if you want to try and not have to use so much soil in a large container. You have mentioned don't put rocks in, but would sticks or leaves or anything take up space?
At the Glen Carlin garden, particularly for the plants you'd be including in the shade that would need a richer soil mix, we actually use a higher percentage of leaf mulch. We are lucky enough to have a free source of that here in our county. So we try to have a good supply of that on hand and put some of that in the bottom and then perhaps mix it in a bit with the soil that's being added.
Mhm. Well, what do you think about the sticks and leaves in the bottom? Is that?
I'd have to think about that. The one concern about the leaves, depending on the type of leaf, is that they may create some kind of a matted base,
Mhm,
and you
mhm.
wouldn't want that acting the same way that the rocks or the gravel do, preventing water to pass through. Let me think about, or maybe do a little research and see what I think about the
Mhm.
sticks being used.
Okay. Someone asked which alum you'd recommend, either American or hairy.
I think if you refer to the plant lists, I've used both of them. The Autumn Bride cultivar of hairy alum root, Pucera villosa, is a particularly showy version of that plant. But I found that both of them are attractive. The straight species flower heads are not going to be showy in the sense that some of these other flowers are. The flowers like purple coneflower or the orange coneflower or the milkweed, they're not going to have that kind of showy blossom. But I think they still are attractive with their tall flower spikes, just in a more subtle way.
Someone else mentioned that they haven't been able to find the straight species of moss phlox and only cultivars. Is the straight species available?
I have only seen them sold with named varieties, but
Uh-huh.
these are being sold in that fashion by native plant sellers, sellers that specialize in native plants. And I think that's just how they're made available by the breeders. I can't say that I've ever seen a plant that was simply labeled moss phlox. It had a name that referred to the pink variant of it, or
Uh-huh.
a blue or a lavender flowered or a white flowered variant of it. To my mind, there is no particular problem using those cultivars. Those are going to be equally attractive to the pollinators.
Another question, how often do you think you need to remove the plants from the pot, refresh the soil, prune the roots, do that kind of maintenance? How often do you have to do that?
Right. I'll try to provide a little more information on that in the addendum document. And you may even see in some of these articles that I'm referring to, particularly the one for the Northern Virginia Bird Alliance. That particular organization actually was originally known as a local representative of the Audubon Society. So when you look at the article, you may see the Audubon reference, but that may talk a little bit about that. And just a couple of comments based on what Ben Murphy suggested in his container gardening discussion. Now, he, of course, was dealing with vegetable plants, which are going to be taken out and replaced on a more regular basis, as
Yeah.
opposed to keeping perennial plants in a single container. All I can say is, as you saw with those Glen Carlin plants, some of them have already been in the pots for several years. So I would think that you could probably keep those going for at least 2 to 3 years. Plants
Mm.
like the blue bisque flower and the base plant that we used, the loosestrife, that are very aggressive and spreading. You may not need to lift absolutely every plant up out of the pot, but you may want to section off certain parts of an overly abundant plant and remove that, either put it in a different pot, share it with someone else.
Mhm.
But I'll try to provide more thorough information on that.
I'm having trouble weeding the questions out from all the wonderful compliments you're getting, but I think here's the last one. What is your opinion on plant pot discs with holes that fit partway down in large containers to help minimize the amount of soil needed?
Okay, this is something new to me, and I'll definitely want to investigate that. That would address the question that was posed earlier about the weight of having to use so much soil. So I'm not familiar with those, but I will be happy to look into that. As I've said, any other questions that I haven't answered as thoroughly as you might like. Or if I see any questions that we haven't caught that are printed in the chat, I'll be going over the chat very carefully over the next few days. So look for an addendum document that will be mailed out to you certainly by sometime next week. And that will also be posted on the website along with the edited and captioned recording.
Okay, I think that does it, Elaine. You know, I like a lot of your presentations, but this one was really special, I think. And you will look in the chat and see how many people are thanking you for this wonderful, wonderful talk.
Thank you all so much for
Anyway,
attending. Thank you for your compliments. And I hope that good variety of plant combinations that I've suggested today maybe give you some inspiration for creating some of your own garden combinations.
yeah.
So good luck and happy gardening.
Thank you, Elaine. Bye-bye. And thanks to Julie for a great chat.